In this presentation, I'd like to present an overview of ecosystem-based management. It really builds on the principles that were discussed in Bill's presentations about how scientific paradigm shifts have taken place and how environmental management has evolved. This will consider ecosystem-based management as really the modern construct for environmental management. It makes it more complex but also more inclusive. So there are four elements which I think are fundamental to ecosystem-based management: integration, adaptation, precaution, and sustainability. So in this presentation, I'll review all four in general and then hold for the next presentation the issues of adaptation or adaptive management and sustainability, particularly this notion of resilience. So if we are thinking about how we manage things conventionally, environmental resources and environments conventionally, each agency, for example, will have its own set of objectives and responsibilities, as indicated in this general diagram here, say between a natural resources agency, environmental protection agency, and one that involved in land use. And even within natural resources, there's a subdivision of those who work on forest, those who work on wildlife, fisheries, and so on. Of course, then within that, we have folks who are working on managing oysters or managing striped bass, managing blue crabs, or managing menhaden. But the problem is, of course, is that if we manage those all one at a time, even those resources, those fishery resources, we neglect the important connections among them. So, for example, striped bass eat blue crabs and eat menhaden. What happens if you reduce the number of menhaden? Do they eat more striped bass? What is the role of oysters in providing habitat for all of these other three species? So this has evolved to what we might call multi-species management, in which we try to integrate management across those particular species-specific resources. And then, taken in a broader context, fisheries management is now pursuing what it calls ecosystem-based fisheries management. That takes into account not only the fisheries, but the other resources, as well as the conditions of the environment. Ecosystem-based management is an approach to try to overcome the stovepiping of management objectives. And its goal is to include the whole ecosystem, including humans, as an important part of these ecosystems that we're managing. And the objective then is to maintain this ecosystem in a healthy, productive, and resilient condition. We'll get back to what we mean by resilience in a bit. The objective then, as we said, is to do that so that it provides the services that humans want and need. It is place-based, that it has to be defined given the particular environment and place that it exists. It is explicitly accounts for the interconnections among these systems, for example, among air, land, water, and it integrates ecological and social, economic and institutional perspectives by recognizing their strong interdependencies. So I'm asking you to read this ecosystem-based management consensus, which is on the Moodle site. There's also a few interesting web links here that you might want to pursue to learn more about ecosystem-based management and ecosystem-based management tools that are available. One of the things I mentioned that I was involved in was the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy that put together this rather thick report of all the things we're doing in the ocean, and it concluded basically we're not doing a very good job of managing these all in a harmonious, simultaneous way. And if there's one major recommendation from this report is that we ought to do this, we ought to manage our activities in the ocean in an ecosystem-based approach. It lists in this report a number of guiding principles such as sustainability, stewardship, preservation of biodiversity. If you go through the report, you see all of these things. And so the point I want to make here is that you can draw from this a number of things. First of all, this issue of integration among multiple uses and among the different media, ocean, land, atmosphere. Another important point is this notion of sustainability, this objective that we want to try to sustain the quality and conditions of the environment and the services that they provide over the long run. And, of course, that it has to be adaptive. It has to be prepared to change. It has to learn by doing this notion of adaptation. unsaid in this report because of the political controversy surrounding the issue among the commissioners of this particular case, although it's referred to in a number of ways. I think another fourth guiding principle in ecosystem-based management is this notion of precaution. When we take steps and do things, how do we provide sufficient level of caution to prevent unintended consequences? So, integration, adaptation, sustainability, and precaution are what we'll be exploring. These are continued. This idea of ecosystem-based management is considered in the new U.S. National Ocean Policy. There's a report that's out now, actually an interim draft implementation plan for this policy, and it lists four major goals, overarching. And the first among them is adopt ecosystem-based management. So we as a nation are trying to find a way to do this across agencies, across uses, across sectors, and across ecosystems, across environments. You can access this report with the URL that's given on this slide, and there is on page 9 to 17 a more detailed description of its approaches to ecosystem-based management. So let's explore these elements a bit farther. We have integration, sustainability, and I said I want to highlight particular the notion of resilience, precaution, and we want to explore what's been called the precautionary principle, adaptation, in particular explore this notion of practice of adaptive management. And to put it in context of many of the things we'll be discussing here within this region in the Chesapeake Bay, I'm asking that you read these two papers which I wrote or co-wrote that include a perspective on how we're doing with respect to those four cornerstones of ecosystem-based management for the Chesapeake Bay system. So first, integration. We have to integrate in a number of dimensions. There's intergovernmental, the example I gave earlier showing the three agencies, one dealing with resources, one dealing with environmental quality, and one dealing with the land use is an example. We have to integrate also, not only in that dimension across agencies, but also vertically, if you will, between state and federal agencies, between state and local agencies that are addressing those issues. So that intergovernmental integration alone is often very challenging and difficult. We have to integrate across media, air, land, water. This is also difficult because our technical expertise is often separated and divided along those media. Scientists who study oceans don't necessarily interact with those that study landscapes very effectively. It has to be ecosystemic. That is, it has to be able to develop the linkages and the cause and effect relationships and interactions, and across those media and across the components of the ecosystem within each medium. It has to be intersectoral, but among users, among those interested in commercial shipping, between those interested in fishing, recreational and sport fishing, for those interested in conservation. It has to work across those sectors. And it has to be interdisciplinary, involving very disparate disciplines, not only extending across the natural sciences, but also into engineering, into the social sciences. So as you can see, this integration is essential but challenging. So I'm going to move now to adaptive management. And this is the notion that we have to be prepared to react and change courses when things we're doing to manage the environment don't work or aren't working like we thought they were, or if the environmental conditions change. It has to be on its toes, if you will, and be prepared to adapt in its approaches as we learn more. So the elements of adaptive management are that these management objectives are not set in stone, but are regularly revisited and accordingly revised. It needs some model about how we expect the system that is working and what will be the consequences of our management activities. It has to include a range of management choices It has to have a monitoring program to evaluate the outcomes and a mechanism for incorporating all this information into learning about future decisions. And it needs a collaborative structure for stakeholder participation in learning. I'll come back to this issue of adaptive management in a little bit in the next presentation. But I do want to talk about precautionary principle. As I mentioned, it is somewhat politically controversial because there are those who hold on to it to stop almost any actions that humans are proposing. And of course, the economic interests abhor these obstacles. So if the precautionary principle, quite simply, is if the consequences of an action are unknown, but are judged not just by anyone, but with some scientific credibility, to have a high risk of being negative, then it's better not to carry on the action rather than risk the uncertain but possible negative effects. When an activity raises threats to humans, our health or environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established. So it shifts the burden from those burden of proof from those on the basis of the negative consequences to oppose an action to the burden of proof shifts to those who propose an action in the absence of negative consequences in order to allow an action. There's an overview of this concept in this article by Foster, which you can access online through Science Magazine. So the history of the precautionary approach, if you look at it, it's what the Hippocratic Oath is that doctors take, right? First, do no harm. The concept was further refined in environmental law in Germany in the 1970s. There was a landmark agreement in the North Sea which took some precautionary steps even though there wasn't an evidence of a serious effect that sort of set a standard for at least European decision-making. Is included in the Rio Declaration by UN, and it's included in various U.S. laws, including fisheries laws. And it's very much in debate over issues related to pesticide use, of drugs for that matter, endangered species, genetically modified organism, food safety, and so on in this country. It's been criticized, as I've said, as being impractical because everything carries some risk. So if we'd be frozen, as this essay by the right-wing Cato Institute, which suggests it's a paralyzing principle, we could do nothing. It could be, it's generally only applied to new technologies and actions rather than retroactively to things that we've already been doing. It doesn't take into account weighing the benefits against the potential risks. And it can be used or thought to be overused as overly protectionist, or even proponents would be suggested to be Luddites. The last point I want to make here is sustainability. You've heard this term a lot. We are very interested in raising this issue of how do we sustain our environment, the resources that it provides over the long run, rather than exploit them to the exclusion of their future value. And it has roots not only in our general common language, but also in international agreements. So the famous Brundtland Commission in 1987 defined it as meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations. So it's fundamentally long-term intergenerational and makes us think about what our children and grandchildren will have to deal with and have available to use as resources to avoid overexploitation. On the next presentation, I'll explore this notion a bit further, particularly this idea of resilience. How can we build in resilience in our systems so that they can be sustained, changing with the conditions and time, but sustained over the long run, their value to us and the services that they provide.